welcome everyone. I'm Emily Omier. I am going to talk about product strategy for open source projects and open source companies. Just a quick show of hands. When I say product strategy, does everyone understand what I mean? Okay, so if I call on somebody, will you be able to define product strategy? Does anyone want to raise their hand? Nobody wants to raise their hand. Okay, well, I'm going to go over it a little bit. But first I'll introduce myself. I'm Emily Omier. I travel to conferences with my daughter, so it is very easy to spot me when I go to a conference. I'm also a consultant. I work with open source companies, largely on product strategy. I host a podcast called The Business of Open Source, and I also organize a conference called Open Source Founder Summit, which is for leadership in open source companies. Okay, so the reason that I wanted to give this talk is because most open source projects take what I would call a random approach to product strategy, which is basically not having a product strategy at all. On the other hand, product strategy is really critical for open source companies and how they survive and how they thrive. In fact, in my opinion, product strategy, or the sort of key questions that you have to answer in order to succeed as an open source company, come down to product strategy questions. When people talk about like how are you going to monetize your open source project, etc., basically you're asking them to make a product strategy decision. It's about what product are we going to build. So just to define a couple of terms, right? Strategy is basically at a very high level, how do we, using our limited resources, allocate those resources so we can get the results that we want? Product strategy is about how do we allocate our limited resources in terms of what are we going to build into our product. When you think about this as in terms of other types of strategy, like marketing strategy, how are we going to tell the world? How are we going to use our limited resources to tell the world, spread the message about our product? But product strategy is really about concretely what is going into our product. Sometimes people confuse this with your product roadmap. So think of product strategy as the North Star for how you decide what goes into your product roadmap, and extremely crucially, what does not go into your product roadmap, which is often the more important piece of that question. Okay, so product strategy essentially should answer, first of all, what is the purpose of this product or this project for me or my organization? When you have a commercial product, this is still a question that you want to ask. And it's actually not as straightforward as a lot of people think. So you can have a commercial product whose purpose is not to turn a profit. I think we have some people who were stuck downstairs. Come on in, come on in, come on in. There's still a couple of seats left, especially here in the front. I'll try not to spit on you or anything like that. I'll try very hard. No promises. Okay, I'm going to wait until everyone comes in. Come up to the front. Come up to the front. Not just for the good students. Okay, so I was just talking about the core questions that you want to answer as part of your product strategy or a product strategy. This is just in general when you're thinking about product strategy. And the first question that often gets overlooked is, what is the purpose of this product, or in the context of open source, this project, for me as the creator or for my organization if I'm doing this as part of my employment? So this is actually, I think, even more important in the context of open source, but even in the context of just a regular old commercial product, defining why this product matters for our company is actually really important, and it is not always just because we want to turn a profit. It could be we're going to take a loss on this product, but we want to enter a new geographic area, for example. We want to enter a new industry vertical, so we're going to take a loss on this product. Or we expect this product to turn massive amounts of profit. But knowing which one of those things you're aiming for is going to dramatically influence the decisions that you make in your product development. Now, in open source projects, this is also important because there are a lot of different reasons why you might decide to create an open source project. If it's just for you personally, this matters a little bit less, but it is still important to think about. If you are doing this as part of your employment, it's still important to think, like, why does this open source project matter to my company? Because if the answer is, it doesn't matter, that's going to be a problem long term. Okay, the next question you want to ask is, what is the unique value that users get out of this project that they cannot get anywhere else? And that is compared to the whole ecosystem, not necessarily just other open source projects, but also commercial alternatives, also the duct tape versions, so manual processes, just ignoring problems because they're not hurting very badly right now. Those are all sort of the duct tape ways, the duct tape alternatives. And then the third thing is, who is the ideal user of this project? This is that you'd answer the same questions for a commercial product. These are the sort of core product strategy questions. Now, there's a couple of things that are different about open source projects. It's quite a bit more complicated. First of all, these are all, in fact, I'm sure that there's many things that I've missed about how open source projects are more complicated in terms of product strategy than straight commercial products. But these are some examples. So first of all, if you have just a straight proprietary software product, or you're building some sort of physical widget, you're not going to have random people submitting PRs. You're going to have less feedback in general. And in fact, that can be a huge problem. But sometimes open source projects actually have too much feedback. They have so much feedback that they don't really know what to make of it. And they also don't know how to prioritize which of the feedback is actually important, who to listen to and who to not listen to. Now, it's one thing if you just get PRs from random people, you can safely ignore those. What if you get PRs that you would like to ignore, but it's from an individual that you know, and you would not like to make that person mad? Now you have a challenge that you, again, would not experience in just a straight proprietary software world, or if you're building a widget. So sometimes you're going to have lack of alignment between maintainers. Product strategy is really important, as really core strategy to your project. And if the 2 or 3 or 10 people who are running it do not agree on things like what makes this project different, or who are our ideal users, they're not going to agree on what the product strategy should be, ergo they will not agree on what they should prioritize in terms of development next. Open source projects almost always have even more limited resources than a lot of straight commercial products. And then the thing that's in red, you are not directly making money on your open source project. So you do have to find a way to protect your ability to monetize, no matter what your relationship with open source what the relationship between monetization for your company and open source is. In some cases, this will be not complicated at all. In other cases, it will be quite complicated. So let's talk about the idea of the purpose of this product for my organization. By the way, one of the annoying things about talking about product and project is that sometimes I mix up the two words because they're so darn close. Okay, so some reasons why people might want to create an open source project. One is for fun. This is the stereotype of the open source developer, creating a project for fun. Now, how common or not common that actually is, we can have a discussion about that. In some ecosystems, it's very common. In some, it's actually quite rare, and most people are being paid for all of the open source work that they do. If you individually are just working on open source for fun, there's nothing wrong about that, but it's worthwhile to be self-aware, because then you can say, I'm doing this for fun, I do not need to get any ROI out of it. You will make different decisions. But if you are getting paid to work on this open source project, chances are your organization does have some kind of goal. And if you cannot identify the goal that or the ROI that your organization might be getting out of your open source project, chances are you will not get to work on it for very much longer. Some relatively standard reasons why you might do an open source project: to help with recruiting, to improve your internal code quality, as a marketing play, as like a loss leader for other things. Think about all the open source projects that Microsoft maintains. Those are largely loss leaders for everything else that Microsoft does. And then, of course, maybe you want to monetize it. Maybe you're in an open source company. If that is the goal, there's actually a lot of different ways that your open source project could help or potentially hinder. And you want to be able to identify which of those ways, what off the menu of how you could create a link between your open source project and your revenue, what you're actually going for. Okay, what is your unique value in the ecosystem? Okay, so your project is going to compete with a lot of different things. It's going to compete with commercial software. It's going to compete with other open source projects. It's going to compete with doing nothing. It's going to compete with losing sleep at night because you know that there's a problem, but you don't deal with it. And you really have to understand what it is that your project does that none of those other options do. And it has to be in terms of a value. So this isn't a feature. So it's not we support single sign-on. It's not we're multi-cluster. It's not a feature. It's a value. It's that we improve your security posture. It's that we provide or we allow we give you redundancy so you don't have any downtime. It's an outcome that people get. And sometimes you'll find that all the alternatives will give you pieces of the same outcome, but you have to choose between them. That can be something that you get. If you're able to get all three of three desirable things and everyone else forces you to make a choice, well, that's a value too. But you do need to understand what is it that you're getting, that your project is delivering, that there's no other way to get. And then who is your ideal user? So when we talk about ideal users, we're thinking about characteristics of people who are going to be really, really happy with your project. So one of the nuances with open source projects is that there's actually a lot of different levels of ideal users. There's sort of anonymous users, people download your project and they use it and they're happy. People who get involved with your community. That could be people who download your project, they're happy, they start answering questions, they start asking questions. That's one level. Then we have people who are contributing code. That's another level. And those people at different places on the contributor ladder, we could say, they have slightly different characteristics. That is kind of going another level. It's a subtlety of open source projects, but regardless, you do have to be aware of what is your ideal user's characteristics. That could be their job title, although that's often way too broad. Sometimes I'll talk to companies and they're like, our ideal user is a developer. And I'm like, that's not very helpful because I've learned almost nothing about what this person is trying to accomplish in their job, except that they write software, right? So you have to be very, very specific. We're talking like They're a software developer. They're an expert in X language. They work for an organization that is in a particular vertical. That what types of constraints are they working under? Now, another thing about open source projects is that often you can attract people because of their beliefs. Now, sometimes these beliefs are what I would call like technical beliefs. They are really invested in solving a problem in a particular way. That's another subtlety of open source projects, because you're trying to get people who agree with your technical approach on a problem that you wouldn't even know if it was a commercial software, how they had managed to solve this problem. But somebody who thinks that your approach is technically sound and is the right way to approach this. But you can also have people with like a philosophical ideal. So sometimes your ideal user will be somebody who is very, very paranoid about privacy. Paranoid to the point where many people would make fun of them. Now, if that's the case, that's something you want to be aware of, because you also want to make sure that as you're thinking about your product strategy and you're making decisions about what goes on your roadmap, you are not making decisions that are going to alienate that type of user. Because that's what this is about. It's about reinforcing the values that you are already providing and doing things that your ideal users are going to find attractive and not that aren't going to turn them off. One big anti-pattern here is consumer characteristics. So somebody's age, somebody's marital status, whether or not they have children. This is very, very rarely relevant in the context of an open source project, or really like most B2B software. But in open source, like this does not matter, does not belong when you're in your product strategy. Okay. So now let's talk about open source companies. All right. So when I think of open source companies and how an open source company survives and makes money, it's that they manage the delta in value between what somebody gets from their open source project and what somebody gets from paying them, from becoming a customer. And this is a challenge, because if you want your open source project to take off, you have to deliver some kind of value to your open source users, and it has to be significant. But then you have to do it all over again in your commercial product. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. But this is a product strategy question, because it's not just about convincing somebody through marketing that your commercial product is worth buying. You actually have to, at the end of the day, deliver. Okay. The other thing is that you shouldn't feel, at least not too excessively, like your product is competing with your project. This is a pain point that a lot of open source leaderships has, feeling like they're cannibalizing themselves. And if you can get your product strategy right, you can be really clear on the value that your product delivers versus what your project delivers, on who your ideal user versus who your ideal customer is. You can feel confident that you're not cannibalizing yourself. So I have a couple of quotes here from my podcast about the challenges of building a product that is going to be differentiated enough from your project that people will end up paying for it. So you do have the advantage, if you have an open source project, that you have a lot of feedback from users, and you can use that to help you figure out what is going to be the best thing to build into your commercial product. What is the thing that your users are saying, with a value that they're saying they would like to get from your product? What is it that they say they would like to pay for, basically? There's a couple of different. Okay, so as you're thinking about this, you have to answer these same questions And you have to do it not for your product, but not for your project, but for your product. So as an open source company, you basically have to answer these same product strategies 2 times. So once for your project and once for your product, and understand how those 2 things are related to each other. I'm going to talk a little bit less about the first question, but I'll talk about it a little bit right now. It would seem obvious if you're an open source company that the answer to that first question is obviously, now we need to make some revenue. So the point is for it to make revenue. Yes, that's the case, but oftentimes it's even more complicated because you might, for example, have a SaaS offering that has a free tier. Well, what's the purpose of the free tier? Who is that free tier targeted at? And ideally, you would actually be able to, so if you have a free tier and of your SaaS offering and a pay and some other tier above that, you would want to answer these questions for every single tier, because ultimately they are different products. Okay. But when you're thinking about your unique value, right, remember how we had to compare what outcome you're going to get from the project to what outcome you would get from everything else in the ecosystem that it plays in? Well, now you have to also compare your commercial product to the value that you're going to get from your open source project. And you really have to pay attention to what that difference is. So there's a lot of different ways that you do this. Ultimately, again, like this is your monetization strategy. But regardless of what you choose, you still have to make sure that you're paying attention to what that delta in value is. So if your open source project is super easy to run, it is super fast to get started, and now you're going to offer a SaaS version. And the value of your SaaS version is that it's really easy to get started. You can get started in 30 seconds. Well, that's not a very huge difference with your open source project. You're going to struggle. So you have to think about how are you building in that difference. If your open source project is already super secure, and the value of your enterprise version is that it's super secure, again, you're going to really struggle. So you have to make sure that there's really a big difference between what value somebody is getting from being a user versus being a customer. I already said that. Okay, I have an example. So this is a company called Verso that does route optimization. So like if you're a taxi company and you need to figure out the best way to deploy your fleet of vehicles so that everybody gets dropped off and picked up in different time windows, etc. You can do this with their open source project, and the value that they have based on the rest of the ecosystem is that you can do these calculations, which are really complex, very fast. So instead of it taking 30 minutes to do this calculation, you get it back in milliseconds, which means that you can tweak your parameters and you can figure out the thing that works best for you. So that's really cool. You can do that all with the open source project. They also have commercial offering. And the thing that makes the commercial offering different, one, is that they offer some consulting. So if you use their commercial offering, if you're a customer, they will help you make sure that your environment is set up, make sure that the people on your team are on board, that you're handling all of the people issues. But there's also a really important thing, which is that they use different data. And so the route timing is better. And that is a value that is really important to certain types of organizations. So that's a difference. And that's a good example of a difference between what you get from the open source project versus what you get from the commercial offering. Obviously, you also get everything that's in the open source project too. Oop. Okay, so the question for a lot of open source companies is, how do you figure out what you should do? So here's a couple of quotes from the podcast. The key almost always is listening to your community. A really important thing here is that oftentimes it's not the interesting technical challenges. Sometimes it's not even it's not the obvious thing. Sometimes it's not even something that's directly related to your project. That's the best way to monetize it. Sometimes it's something that's more adjacent, and sometimes it's not a super challenging technical issue, but rather just something that has value to your users. Okay. So who is the ideal customer for your commercial product? And you have to think about, how is your ideal customer different from your ideal user? There's a couple of ways that customer and user profiles could be related. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're a target, sometimes they are two circles that don't touch. It's really important just to know, what does this look like in our particular in our particular example, because then you can understand if it's even realistic to think about a flow from open source user to customer, and if so, what that flow is going to look like. NetBird, this example I actually took from, I believe, my last podcast episode, but their open source users are usually people managing a home lab. They're home users, whereas their commercial offering is really enterprise focused. So that's an example of like two circles that do not touch. Okay, so I'm almost at the end. Your product strategy should be a tool for internal alignment. In a lot of cases, you can also use product strategy, and by that I mean articulating in a public-facing document what your open source project's purpose for being for your organization is, what the unique value is that it provides, and who your ideal user and or your ideal customer. You can use that for external communication as well. It's a really good way to communicate with both your community and with potential customers about why you're invested in open source, what this means for your company, but also what are you going to get from this project, and are you or are you not an ideal user for this project? So just a quick recap. I know we're almost out of time. You need to understand the purpose of the project for your company, understand the purpose of the product, understand the unique value in the ecosystem and your ideal user profile. There's some things that are unique about open source, about product strategy for open source projects, and open source companies have to pay attention to the difference in product strategy between project and product, and you also have to figure out the interplay between the two. And that is it.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I have a question, hasn't the European Union just kind of answered the question for the differentiation between the project and the product with the need for the Cyber Resilience Act and Product Liability Directive? I mean, that gives companies and projects a very easy path forward to show where their benefit is, or how does that play into your framework?
I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can provide value. Yes, it could be that we're going to provide SBOMs for our open source, for our commercial products. It could be that our commercial products are going to we're going to guarantee compliance. That's absolutely one way to prove or to add value. It's just not the only one.